St. Petersburg. 1738. A merchant from Bukhara, a city most Europeans had never visited and couldn't reliably locate on a map, signs a contract with the Russian imperial crown. The contract is straightforward. He will deliver a dried plant root to the Russian state. Fixed price. Fixed schedule. His descendants will keep delivering it for the next 44 years. What's strange isn't that the deal happened. Merchants have always moved goods across borders. What's strange is the value recorded in Russian Senate documents, documented by historian Clifford Faust, in a book published by Princeton University Press. At peak, a single transaction could fund the Russian army for a year. One root. Dried. Wrapped. Carried across a steppe most Europeans had never crossed. I want to be careful here, because I'm not about to tell you this was suppressed technology, or the product of a lost empire, or something a secret group decided you shouldn't. No, I'm going to tell you what the documented record actually shows, and the documented record is, in certain ways, stranger than any of those things. My name is I don't have all the answers. What I have is a thread, and if you pull it slowly, from the right end, you end up somewhere that no mainstream history of medicine ever quite takes you. The root was rhubarb. Not the rhubarb you put in a pie. Rheum palmatum, a high-altitude species that grows in the borderlands of what is now Qinghai and Gansu in western China. It does not grow in Europe. It does not grow in Russia. It grows in a place most 18th century Europeans couldn't name, couldn't describe, and couldn't visit. In Europe, this specific rhubarb was the most trusted purgative on the continent. That sounds small. It wasn't. Before intravenous medicine, before surgical anesthesia, before anyone understood germ theory, bowel obstruction, dysentery, and intestinal infection killed millions every year. A reliable purgative wasn't a luxury item. It was a frontline medical intervention, prescribed across the social spectrum from the Tsar's household to rural field hospitals. European physicians trusted this root above all others. But they had a problem they almost never admitted openly. They did not know where it came from. The root arrived through middlemen. Nomadic traders. It crossed a distance that most European physicians couldn't fathom, passing through so many hands that by the time it reached Amsterdam, Antwerp, or London, no doctor could. Point to a field and say, "This is where my medicine grows." Now here is where the story gets specific, specifically documented, in a way I want to sit with for a moment. In 1735, the Russian crown formalized what had been an informal arrangement, a state monopoly on medicinal rhubarb. Every root entering Europe from the east would pass through Russian hands first. 1 year later, in 1736, they opened a customs inspection post at a town called Kyakhta, a border town. A single desk. Every shipment of medicinal rhubarb entering Russia was graded by Russian officials at that desk. Quality ratings assigned, certificates issued. Substandard product was not sold at a discount. It was not quietly moved to a secondary market. It was publicly burned. Think about that. The most valuable medicine in Europe processed at a single choke point, in a town that most Europeans had never heard of, on the border of a region they could barely describe. The Kyakhta inspection post ran for 46 years, from 1736 until 1782, when Catherine the Great ended the monopoly. Historians Clifford Faust and Changche Chia, writing separately, Faust through Princeton University Press and Chang through the Asian Medicine Journal, have documented the full trade records. Russian Senate Archive. UK State Papers. Sound toll registers at major European ports. This is not obscure knowledge. It is just not in the popular story of medicine. And here is the first place the official explanation collapses for me, not because anything supernatural happened, but because the standard Western account of medical history simply does not include this chapter. The story most of us are taught runs: ancient Greece, then Rome, then a dark gap, then the Renaissance, then modern science, clean, linear, European. A coherent inheritance passed hand to hand across a single cultural tradition. But the most valuable medicine in Europe, for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, came from somewhere that story doesn't have a proper name for. The Qing emperor in Beijing noticed this dependency. Around the time Catherine ended the monopoly and smuggling spiked, Qing court officials interpreted the surge in illegal rhubarb trade as evidence of European desperation. This is documented in Chang Che-Kia's 2006 paper for Asian Medicine Journal, Origins of a Misunderstanding. The Qianlong emperor genuinely believed he could use rhubarb as a geopolitical weapon. He issued embargoes. He referenced this belief in his later letter to the British Crown. Two empires, Russia and Qing China, treated a single dried root as a strategic asset. This is not metaphor. It is in the diplomatic archives. Here is the second thread. It requires going further back. In the year 1025, a physician in Bukhara completed a medical encyclopedia. His name, in the Arabic scholarly tradition, was Ibn Sina. In Europe, he was called Avicenna. He was born in 980 in a village near Bukhara, a city that is now in Uzbekistan, and he produced a 5-volume text he titled Al-Qanun fi al-Tib, in English, The Canon of Medicine. The canon covered every known disease, every drug in use, every clinical procedure available to a physician of his era. It was exhaustive. It was systematic. It was, by any reasonable measure, the most comprehensive medical textbook produced before the modern period, and it became the standard curriculum at European universities. Not for a decade, not for a generation, for roughly 6 centuries. The first Latin printed edition came out around 1473 in Strasbourg, 5 volumes, each one larger than a modern dictionary. By the early 16th century, there were at least 15 separate printed editions in circulation across Europe. The Library of Congress holds a 1597 Persian manuscript copy, digitized, public domain, searchable by anyone online. Yale's Medical Library holds copies. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France holds copies. The Qatar National Library holds early manuscripts. This text is not lost. It was the text. European medical students from the 15th century through most of the 17th century studied it the way medical students today study Gray's Anatomy, as the authoritative reference, the baseline from which everything else was measured. And then it disappeared from European curricula. I want to be precise here, because the easy narrative, they suppressed it, is not accurate. What happened was a genuine shift: European university reform, the rise of empirical anatomy, the work of Vesalius and Harvey, and the scientific revolution. These were real advances. The displacement of Avicenna from European medical schools was, in part, the natural consequence of better methodology. But here is where I pause. Avicenna didn't disappear from medicine. He disappeared from the Western story of medicine. There is a difference. The canon remained in active use in traditions that European cartographers, from the 16th century onward, placed under a single broad geographic label: medical schools in Bukhara, in Samarkand, in the Tibetan highlands, in the Buryat monasteries of Siberia. These traditions never stopped building on Avicenna. They never stopped updating him, contesting him, extending him, the way any living medical tradition does with its foundational texts. They just stopped being cited by European universities once those institutions moved on. And when European universities wrote the history of medicine, they wrote from their own citations. This raises a simple but critical question. Whose continuity counts as medical history? I'm not claiming the answer. I'm saying the question has been sitting there, largely unasked in places like the Library of Congress for decades. Act 3, the Atlas. I want to show you something specific, not a building, not a map, a painting. In the year 1687 in Lhasa, a regent named Desi Sangye Gyatso commissioned a project. He wanted a visual encyclopedia of Tibetan medicine, not written descriptions, paintings. Every herb used in treatment, every mineral compound, every animal substance in the pharmacopoeia, every diagnostic chart, every pulse point on the human body, every stage of embryonic development as understood by Tibetan physicians of his era, every symptom pattern, every surgical instrument in common use. The result was 76 painted plates on linen cloth. Approximately 10,000 individual illustrations. The project was completed by 1703. The regent who commissioned it was deposed and killed in 1705 before the work could be fully disseminated. The painting survived. One of only 3 known sets of this atlas exists today at the National Museum of the Republic of Buryatia in the city of Ulan-Ude in Siberia. Ulan-Ude, a city most people, including most historians of medicine, have never visited and couldn't locate without a map. In May 2023, UNESCO inscribed the Atlas of Tibetan Medicine in its memory of the World Register. This is the same register that holds the Magna Carta, the Gutenberg Bible, and the archives of the League of Nations. UNESCO decided that this atlas, 10,000 illustrated entries of pharmacological, anatomical, and diagnostic knowledge, was among the most important documentary heritage on the planet. The atlas is in UNESCO's memory of the world. You can verify this at the UNESCO website. And it is almost entirely absent from the popular history of medicine. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. A systematic body of medical knowledge, given the highest institutional recognition on Earth, sits in a regional museum in Siberia. Referenced in academic papers in PubMed and the Rubin Museum's scholarly archive. Described by historians at the University of Washington and the Wellcome Trust. Not hidden. Simply not part of the story we tell about where medicine comes from. If this kind of investigation is worth your time, the kind that actually goes to the Library of Congress and UNESCO rather than just recycling the same screenshots, consider subscribing. This series goes to primary sources, names its institutions, and doesn't ask you to believe anything it can't cite. That's the only promise I'm making. Act 4. The building that shouldn't be there. There is a building in St. Petersburg, not a cathedral, not a palace, a Buddhist temple. It was commissioned in 1909, completed in 1915. Designed by a Russian architect named Gavril Baranovsky, the stained glass was designed by Nicholas Roerich, one of the most celebrated Russian painters of the early 20th century, trained at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. The man who commissioned it was a Buryat Lama named Agvan Dordziev, a diplomat and religious scholar who served as personal tutor to the Dalai Lama and as an envoy between the Tibetan Buddhist establishment and the Russian imperial court. The temple was called Datsan Gunjakoine, a full Tibetan tradition Buddhist temple complex, built in the imperial capital of Russia, consecrated on August 10, 1915, with Tsar Nicholas II's formal approval. At the same time this temple was being built, a family of Buryat physicians named Badmaev operated a Tibetan medical practice on Poklanaya Gora, across the city. Pyotr Alexandrovich Badmaev, a Buryat doctor trained in both European and Tibetan medicine, treated members of the Russian imperial family and presented a formal memorandum to Alexander III, arguing that Tibetan pharmacology could serve as an instrument of Russian imperial influence in Central Asia. I want to be careful here. The Badmaev legacy is genuinely contested. The Russian statesman Sergei Vite, in his published memoirs, described Pyotr Badmaev in terms that translate charitably as a clever but unreliable operator. This is in the historical record. The clinical results were mixed. I'm not sanctifying him. But the fact of the practice is documented. A Buryat physician, trained in a medical tradition, rooted in the territories labeled on every major European atlas as a single vast region, treating the Russian imperial family. At the height of the empire's power. This is not fringe, it is archivally documented and almost entirely absent from the popular story of medicine. Then came 1917. Then came 1929. That year, the Soviet Politburo issued directives that would systematically close, confiscate, and in many cases physically destroy the religious institutions of the Soviet Union. This was not targeted against one people. The same campaign destroyed Russian Orthodox churches, mosques, synagogues, and Catholic institutions across the USSR. The Soviet Politburo was, in this respect, thorough and non-discriminating. But what the campaign did to the medical infrastructure of Buryatia deserves to be named precisely. The Aginsky Datsun, founded in 1811, with a monastic medical school that opened in 1861, held 47,525 xylographic printing blocks. Tibetan and Mongolian texts covering medicine, pharmacology, philosophy, and astronomical calculation. A printing and teaching infrastructure assembled across a century of deliberate institutional effort. The Soviet state closed it in the late 1930s. The buildings were repurposed, some as a tuberculosis sanatorium, others as a drug treatment clinic. The printing blocks were scattered. Some were sent to Moscow, some to Leningrad, some to Ulan-Ude. An unknown quantity were destroyed outright. The monastic physicians, trained inheritors of a tradition documented today at Harvard, at Princeton, at UNESCO, were arrested during the Stalinist purges of 1937 to 1942. Many were executed. The silence was deafening. Once I understood what it covered, 206 years of documented medical infrastructure, from the opening of the Kyakhta inspection post in 1736 to the last arrests of the Stalinist purges in 1942. Compressed, scattered, and dropped from the story, not because it was hidden. Because the story of medicine has a shape, and this doesn't fit inside it. I've been circling something. Let me say it directly. Every location I've named in this video, Bukhara, Kyakhta, Ulan-Ude, Aginsky, Lhasa, Poklonnaya Gora, sits inside a region that European cartographers, from approximately the 13th century to the mid-19th century, labeled with a single term on their maps. In 1570, Abraham Ortelius published the first standardized modern atlas. Its title was Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, Theatre of the World. It was the most authoritative geographic reference of its era. Every educated European who needed to understand the shape of the world turned to it first. It contained a dedicated full-page map of a territory labeled, in Latin, Tartaria Sive, Magni Chami, Regni Typus. The Latin is specific. Regni means kingdom. Magni Chami means Great Khan. The full title translates as A Map of Tartary, or the Empire of the Great Khan. The man who called it an empire was not a fringe thinker. He was the most respected cartographer in the world, publishing in Antwerp at the height of his influence. That map is currently held at the National Library of Scotland. It is also at the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress. You can look it up today using the URLs on screen. Nearly 2 centuries later, in 1765, the editors of the Encyclopédie published Volume 15. The Encyclopédie was the defining intellectual project of the French Enlightenment. Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert spent decades attempting to systematize all human knowledge in 28 volumes. It was the most ambitious scholarly undertaking of the 18th century. Volume 15 contained an entry titled Tartaria. It described the territory, present tense, as a great part of Asia, bounded to the north by the Arctic Ocean, to the east by the Sea of Japan and China. Not a historical relic, not a mythological land. A living geographic reality, described in the present tense by the most rigorous scholarly minds of 18th century Europe. And then, within roughly 80 years, the word effectively disappeared from Western maps. Not gradually. Abruptly. The term was replaced with administrative categories that served Russian and Chinese imperial governance, Siberian provinces, Chinese Turkestan, Outer Mongolia. A Harvard historian named Mark C. Elliott published a peer-reviewed paper in the Journal of Asian Studies in 2000. It's on JSTOR, available to anyone with a library card, making exactly this argument. The categories used on Western maps for inter-Asian territories, Tartary included, were invented by outside powers. They did not correspond to how the people living there understood themselves, their land, or their medicine. Elliott's methodology is a legitimate scholarly tool. He asks, whose categories are these? Who created them? Who benefits when they change? Those are the questions underneath this entire video. The Tartaria community, on YouTube, on Reddit, on forums like stolenhistory.net, has been circling these questions for close to a decade. Loudly, often incorrectly. But here is what I think they noticed and got partly right. There is a documented geographic category that appeared on mainstream European maps for 6 centuries. It was described in the Enlightenment's most authoritative encyclopedia. It was used by the most credentialed cartographers of their era. And it disappeared from the Western lexicon within 80 years, coinciding precisely with Russian and Chinese imperial expansion into the region. A Harvard historian confirmed the mechanism of that disappearance in a peer-reviewed paper in 2000. That is the real story. It doesn't require giants. It doesn't require free energy. It doesn't require a single secret organization running a cover-up across centuries. It requires only this, that the people who named the region also had the power to rename it, and that when they renamed it, the previous name, and much of what had been documented under that name, stopped being told. The most upvoted post I found on stolenhistory.net, one of the primary Tartaria community forums, says something I think deserves to be read carefully. I'll quote it. To use the term Tartaria every time one speaks about the Old World cements a misleading view of a Slavic-centric world, where for some reason Russian culture dominated everything else. To this date, not a single proof has been presented why this geographically limited region in Asia called Tartary was worldwide. It is now simply a meme, and in my view it is a dangerous meme, because it limits our possibilities of what the Old World really was, that is from inside the community. The Ortelius map is at the National Library of Scotland, maps.nls.uk. Public domain, you can zoom in. The Avicenna manuscript is at the Library of Congress, loc.gov, item 2yo2167278, digitized, free to access. The Atlas of Tibetan Medicine is at the National Museum of the Republic of Buryatia in Ulan-Ude. UNESCO Memory of the World Register, May 2023. You can look up the registration. Mark C. Elliott's paper, The Limits of Tartary, was published in the Journal of Asian Studies, Volume 59, 2000. It's on JSTOR. If you have a library card, and most public libraries in the US and UK give you JSTOR access for free, you can read it tonight. These are real places, real archives, real documents. Check them. Then decide what you think.